The refectory of Moonlight Abbey received its guests with the quiet gravity of stones that had witnessed centuries of human ceremony, though tonight the long oak table bore crystal glasses rather than wooden bowls, and Persian carpets softened the flagstone floor where once barefoot brothers had walked in contemplative silence. Tall windows, their ancient glass, thick and uneven, filtered the dying light of an October afternoon into amber pools across whitewashed walls, while beeswax candles flickered in iron sconces, casting shadows that seemed to dance with the ghosts of ages past. The air carried the mingled scents of old wood, candle wax, and the faint incense that lingered perpetually in the abbey's stones, creating an atmosphere both sacred and expectant. Lady Honoria Velacour moved among her guests with the measured grace of one born to command, without effort, her silver hair caught in an elegant chignon, her manner suggesting both warmth and an indefinable reserve. She wore black silk that rustled softly as she paused beside each arrival, offering tea from a Georgian service that had graced this table for 3 generations. Her voice, cultured and carefully modulated, carried the particular cadence of those accustomed to being heard without raising their tone. "How delightful that you could join us, Inspector," she murmured to the tall, lean man who stood somewhat apart from the others, his grey eyes taking in the assembled company with the quiet attention of one more accustomed to observing than performing. Inspector Roderick Alleyn inclined his head with courteous precision, his manner suggesting a gentleman at leisure rather than a detective of Scotland Yard. He had accepted Lady Honoria's invitation ostensibly as a friend of mutual acquaintances, though both understood the discretion required when certain gatherings attracted individuals whose reputations might benefit from unofficial oversight. His presence here was delicately arranged, almost accidental in appearance, yet Alleyn found himself studying the interplay of personalities with the same careful attention he might bring to a more formal investigation. Sir Julian Martin dominated the far end of the refectory with the unconscious authority of a man accustomed to purchasing whatever atmosphere he desired. His voice, pitched to carry across the vaulted space, held the particular resonance of one who had never learned to modulate his opinions for the comfort of others. "I trust the acoustics have been properly tested," he was saying to Timothy Bloor, the nervous young stage manager who clutched a sheaf of papers with ink-stained fingers. "The investment I've made in this enterprise warrants professional execution. Perhaps a microphone, discreet, naturally, but audible." Dame Beatrice Latchford's response carried across the stone floor with theatrical precision. "The spoken word has generally muddled along without apparatus, Sir Julian, even in cloisters." She took a delicate sip of sherry as if sampling a line, her theatrical bearing making even this simple gesture appear worthy of applause. The slightest emphasis at the corners of her mouth made her remark both civil and decisive, like a gloved hand restraining an over-familiar gesture. Dr. Lionel Ferris occupied the middle ground both literally and figuratively, his scholar's stoop and wire-rimmed spectacles lending him an air of gentle authority that seemed to calm the more volatile personalities around him. His fingers, long and pale from years of manuscript handling, gestured with precise elegance as he spoke of the Abbey's latest acquisition. "The Psalter is quite extraordinary," he explained, his voice carrying the particular enthusiasm of discovery. "The illuminations suggest a scriptorium of remarkable sophistication. Lady Honoria's generosity in sharing this treasure through our masque is most commendable." Captain Hugh Davenant stood near the great hearth, his military bearing evident despite civilian dress, his weathered hands wrapped around a whiskey glass rather than the delicate teacup his breeding might have demanded. When Sir Julian's laughter jarred against the candlelight, like silver spoons clinking in the wrong glass, Alleyn observed the slight tension in the captain's shoulders, the way his jaw tightened at the sound. The Reverend Peregrine Saumarez, a man whose gentle manner suggested genuine spiritual calling rather than mere social position, seemed to serve as a natural buffer between temperaments that might otherwise clash more openly. Timothy Blore approached Matron Ida Lusk with the diffident urgency of one whose livelihood depended upon mechanical precision. The elderly woman moved with quiet efficiency among the guests, her grey dress and pristine apron suggesting service. Yet her bearing commanded respect rather than condescension. "The mechanism for the moon descent troubles me," Blore confided in an undertone that nevertheless carried to Alleyn's attentive ears. Sir Julian's insistence on modifications, I cannot guarantee the theatrical effect he desires. Matron Lusk's response held the practical wisdom of one who had weathered many storms of artistic temperament. "Do your best, Mr. Blore. We have our ways here. The Abbey has seen grander spectacles than this, and simpler ones too." As conversation continued in carefully modulated tones, Alleyn found himself studying not merely the individuals before him, but the subtle currents that flowed between them: scholarly pride and commercial ambition, artistic integrity and financial necessity, tradition and innovation. The Abbey itself seemed to absorb these tensions into its ancient stones, as if centuries of human passion and conflict had taught it patience with the recurring dramas of mortal concerns. The evening bell began its measured toll across the cloisters, its deep, resonant sound echoing through the refectory and out into the gathering gloom. Each solemn peal seemed to mark not merely the passing of day into night, but the slow, deliberate approach of something yet undefined. Conversation thinned as heads turned toward the sound, and in that moment of shared attention, Alleyn sensed the particular quality of expectancy that precedes performance, or perhaps something less predictable. The candles flickered in a draught that found its way under the ancient arches, and somewhere in the stone passages, a door closed with the sound of finality. The Abbey, ageless and brooding, seemed to gather the evening's tensions into its patient embrace, as if preparing to witness yet another chapter in the endless drama of human ambition and frailty. The cloisters of Moonlight Abbey had surrendered their monastic tranquility to the demands of theatre, their ancient arches now framing a performance space where electric lanterns, cunningly disguised as medieval cressets, cast calculated pools of silver light across flagstones worn smooth by centuries of contemplative footsteps. The covered walkway that surrounded the central garth provided natural galleries for the evening's observers, while the open quadrangle itself served as stage, its weathered font and carved stonework lending an air of timeless mystery to the rehearsal. Above, genuine stars pierced the October sky with crystalline clarity, as if nature herself had chosen to collaborate in the spectacle below, while the faint scent of damp earth and late chrysanthemums drifted from the shadowed garden. Sir Julian Martin moved through this transformed space with the proprietary confidence of one accustomed to reshaping environments according to his vision, his dinner jacket seeming almost aggressively modern against the medieval stones. He positioned himself near the mechanical apparatus suspended above the central font, a gleaming silver disc designed to descend on nearly invisible cables in imitation of the moon's celestial journey. "The descent must be slower, Blore," he declared, addressing Timothy Blore with the casual impatience of financial authority. "More majestic. The audience should feel the weight of cosmic inevitability, not witness a mere stage trick." His hands, soft from years of directing rather than creating, sketched grandiose arcs in the evening air as he repositioned himself at what he clearly considered the focal point of the performance. Lady Honoria observed these adjustments from the shadowed arcade with the composed attention of one who had learned to accommodate necessary compromises while maintaining essential dignities. Her evening coat, a deep blue that seemed to absorb the artificial moonlight, rustled softly as she moved closer to where Inspector Alleyn stood in quiet observation. "Sir Julian's enthusiasm sometimes exceeds his understanding of our limitations," she murmured, her voice carrying the particular restraint of one commenting on a guest's behavior. "The Abbey has its own rhythms, Inspector. They cannot always be improved upon." Her words held layers of meaning that extended far beyond theatrical concerns, and Alleyn noted the slight tension in her gloved hands as she adjusted her shawl. Dame Beatrice Latchford had positioned herself near the ancient lectern where she would deliver her recitation, her theatrical instincts having identified the acoustically superior location despite Sir Julian's attempts to redirect the evening's focus. She wore black velvet that merged with the shadows, making her pale hands and silver hair appear to float with ethereal effect. When Sir Julian suggested that her position might benefit from repositioning closer to his mechanical moon, her response carried the particular precision of one accustomed to defending artistic territory. "I believe, Sir Julian, that the spoken word has managed to hold audiences for several centuries without the assistance of descending machinery. Perhaps we might allow it to continue in that tradition." Her smile remained perfectly gracious, yet the words settled upon the evening air with the weight of gentle mockery. Captain Hugh Davenant emerged from the North Arcade with the silent movement of one whose military training had never entirely departed, despite civilian clothes and the walking stick that suggested old wounds. His presence seemed to alter the atmosphere subtly, introducing an element of barely contained energy that contrasted with the evening's cultivated tranquility. When Sir Julian began explaining how the captain might assist in managing the technical aspects of the performance, Davenant's response carried undertones that had nothing to do with theatrical concerns. "I'm certain your arrangements are quite adequate, Sir Julian. Those of us with practical experience sometimes find elaborate mechanisms less reliable than simpler methods." The words were perfectly civil, yet they seemed to hang in the evening air with the weight of unspoken history. Timothy Blore moved nervously among his equipment, checking cables and testing mechanisms with the anxious precision of one whose professional reputation depended upon flawless execution. The descending moon represented weeks of careful calculation, yet Sir Julian's demands for modification threatened to upset the delicate balance of counterweights and pulleys. "Now for the blackout cue," Blore announced, his voice tight with professional anxiety. "Please remain absolutely still during the darkness. The mechanism continues its descent, and any movement might interfere with the cables." The lights died with theatrical suddenness, plunging the cloisters into profound darkness broken only by distant starlight. For a moment, the only sound was the whisper of cables and the soft mechanical breathing of the descending moon. Then, from somewhere in the blackness near the font, came the unmistakable sound of a brief scuffle, footsteps moving quickly across stone, the rustle of fabric, and what might have been a sharply drawn breath. Sir Julian's voice rose with characteristic impatience. "Confound it, someone's interfering." But his words were cut short by another voice, urgent and low, speaking words that the acoustics of the ancient space rendered indistinct. "Lights!" Blore called out, his professional composure cracking under the strain. When illumination returned to the cloisters, the scene appeared unchanged at first glance. The mechanical moon had completed its descent and now hung suspended directly above the ancient font, its silver surface reflecting the lanterns with serene perfection. The assembled company stood in their appointed positions, though Alleyn noted with practiced observation that several individuals appeared to have shifted slightly during the darkness. Dame Beatrice maintained her position at the lectern with theatrical composure, yet her breathing seemed more rapid than the brief excitement warranted. Captain Davenant had moved closer to the font, his walking stick now held in a different hand. Lady Honoria's voice cut through the moment of uncertainty with practiced grace. "Perhaps that will suffice for this evening's rehearsal. The effect is quite striking." Yet as the company began to disperse toward the warmth of the refectory, Alleyn remained in the shadows of the arcade, his attention drawn to something that seemed subtly wrong with the scene before him. Near the base of the winch apparatus, he observed that one of the smaller guide lines had been newly hitched, the knot showing a freshness against the polished wear of the rest. Close by, a small drip of candle wax had run where no candle stood, and on the stone rim of the font, where the artificial moonlight sharpened every detail, There was the faintest smear that caught the light differently, as if some duller silver had briefly kissed the ancient stone. The mechanical moon continued its gentle sway above the font, yet the air itself seemed charged with an expectancy that had nothing to do with theatrical performance. As the last footsteps faded along the covered walk, Alleyn found himself wondering whether the evening's drama had truly concluded or had merely begun. Somewhere beyond the ambulatory, a door settled without being visibly touched, and the faintest tremor ran through the moon's supporting wire, as if it had been plucked by a cautious finger. Then even that suggestion was gone, and the ancient cloisters resumed their watchful quiet, keeping whatever secrets the darkness had briefly concealed. The cloisters of Moonlight Abbey held the particular stillness that precedes dawn, when night's grip loosens but daylight has not yet claimed dominion over ancient stones. The mechanical moon, obedient to its cables and counterweights, hung motionless above the font in the gray half-light, its silver surface reflecting the pale glow of electric lanterns that had burned through the dark hours. The air carried the mingled scents of damp earth from the central garth and the lingering sweetness of beeswax, though no candles had been appointed for this theatrical space. It was in this hushed interval between performance and reality that Sir Julian Martin was discovered, collapsed beside the font in a posture that suggested neither sleep nor natural repose, but something far more deliberate and final. Timothy Blore, arriving for his customary early inspection of the mechanical apparatus, found the body during his methodical examination of cables and pulleys. His cry of discovery, sharp, involuntary, and immediately stifled by breathing, echoed through the stone passages with sufficient alarm to bring the household from their beds. He stood now at a respectful distance from the scene, his face the color of old parchment, one trembling hand pressed to his mouth, as if to contain words that might prove either indiscreet or damaging. The ceremonial cord from one of the Abbey's liturgical standards had been wound about Sir Julian's throat with a precision that spoke of deliberate intent rather than desperate struggle, its rich silk now serving a purpose far removed from ecclesiastical dignity. Lady Honoria arrived with the composed urgency of one whose breeding had prepared her for crises that must be managed without surrendering to emotion. Her mourning dress, though hastily arranged, showed no sign of disorder, and her silver hair was caught in a simple chignon that suggested haste controlled by long habit. She approached to within a proper distance of Sir Julian's body, her hands clasped before her with the particular stillness that indicates feeling held firmly in check. "Dr. Ferris must be summoned immediately," she said, her voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to command in moments when others might falter. "And perhaps, Inspector Alleyn, your professional expertise might prove necessary after all." The words acknowledged how thoroughly the evening's entertainment had transformed into something requiring different skills entirely. Dr. Lionel Ferris approached the scene with the methodical precision of one whose scholarly training had encompassed more practical anatomical studies than his present academic position might suggest. His examination was conducted with the particular delicacy of a man who understood that death, however violent, deserved dignity in its investigation. His pale fingers, so careful with ancient manuscripts, moved with steady purpose as he confirmed what the scene already suggested. When he rose, his pronouncement came in the measured tones of scientific certainty. "Sir Julian has been deceased for several hours. The cause appears to be strangulation, accomplished with considerable force." He stepped back from the body with the careful movements of one who had confirmed suspicions he would have preferred to dismiss. The Reverend Peregrine Saumarez appeared in his clerical robes, hastily donned over night clothes, his usually composed features showing the strain of pastoral duties undertaken in circumstances that challenged his spiritual training. He knelt beside Sir Julian's body with the automatic reverence of his calling, his voice rising in familiar cadences of prayer, yet trembling with an emotion that seemed to encompass more than conventional grief. "Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord," he murmured, the ancient words echoing strangely in the morning air, as if the stones themselves questioned the appropriateness of such benedictions over a death so deliberately accomplished. Dame Beatrice Latchford emerged from the North Arcade with the measured dignity of one whose theatrical training had prepared her for moments requiring composed performance under extraordinary circumstances. She wore a morning coat of deep blue wool, perfectly arranged despite the early hour, her silver hair showing no sign of hasty preparation. Yet Inspector Alleyn, observing with the quiet attention that had shifted from social guest to professional investigator, noted that her usual theatrical composure seemed to require more conscious effort than customary. "How perfectly dreadful," she said, her voice carrying its characteristic resonance. "Poor Sir Julian. One can hardly credit such violence in so sacred a place." Captain Hugh Davenant arrived with his characteristic silent movement, his walking stick tapping a measured rhythm against the flagstones until he paused at the scene's periphery. His weathered features showed no surprise at finding death in unexpected places. Military experience had evidently prepared him for life's more violent interruptions. Yet his attention fixed immediately upon the mechanical apparatus, with the sharp focus of one whose practical knowledge extended to matters of ropes and rigging. "The equipment's been tampered with," he observed quietly, his voice carrying the authority of technical expertise. "Someone altered the auxiliary lines. This wasn't accidental interference." Blore, finding his voice at last, stammered his confirmation of the captain's assessment. "I warned him about the modifications," he said, his words tumbling together in distress. "Sir Julian insisted on changes to the descent mechanism, but someone's been at the ropes again after I secured them. The hitch is wrong, and that cord—" He gestured helplessly toward the silk wound about Sir Julian's throat. "That belongs to the ceremonial standard by the chapel door." Inspector Alleyn moved through this scene of controlled distress with the particular tact required when investigating among one's social equals, his grey eyes taking in details that others, shocked by the central fact of death, might overlook. Near the base of the winch mechanism, he observed a small pool of hardened candle wax, though no candles had been appointed for the theatrical space. A fat church candle lay incongruously on the narrow ledge behind the font, its brass pricket absent, the wax beneath still soft enough to show recent placement. Most significantly, on the stone rim of the font, where the artificial moonlight fell most directly, there was a faint smudge that caught the light differently. Some dull metallic residue that spoke of silver paint or powder, positioned precisely where someone might have steadied themselves while arranging the mechanical apparatus for purposes far removed from theatrical effect. The morning light strengthened as the Abbey's household gathered in the cloisters, their faces masks of concern that, to Alleyn's discerning eye, seemed to hold calculation beneath the veneer of distress. Each response to his careful inquiries, though properly phrased and appropriately modulated, revealed the subtle tensions that had simmered beneath the previous evening's civilized surface. The mechanical moon continued its gentle sway above the font, no longer a theatrical prop, but a silent witness to events that had transformed a cultural gathering into something far more sinister. As the ancient bell resumed its regular tolling, calling the hours with persistent authority, Alleyn found himself studying not merely the physical evidence of violence, but the careful choreography of shock and composure playing out before him. Someone in this gathered company had moved through the darkness with deadly purpose, using the Abbey's own ceremonial trappings to accomplish murder while the household slept. The silver smear on the font's edge gleamed dully in the strengthening light, and somewhere in the stone passages, a door closed with deliberate softness, as if even now someone sought privacy for thoughts that required careful concealment from the investigation that must inevitably follow. Lady Honoria's drawing room possessed the particular atmosphere of a space where generations had conducted the delicate business of maintaining social order through personal crisis, its oak-paneled walls bearing witness to conversations that required both discretion and authority. Persian carpets in faded jewel tones softened the ancient flagstones, while tall windows filtered the morning light through diamond-paned glass that cast gentle patterns across furniture, chosen for comfort rather than fashion. A fire burned steadily in the carved stone hearth, its warmth necessary against the October chill that seemed to penetrate even the Abbey's most carefully appointed rooms. The scent of dried rose petals from a porcelain potpourri bowl mingled with the faint aroma of China tea and old leather bindings, creating an environment that suggested civilized discourse, despite the circumstances that had made such discourse necessary. Inspector Fox arrived with the quiet efficiency that had made him Alleyn's preferred colleague in matters requiring both tact and thoroughness, his solid presence lending an air of professional competence without the aggressive formality that might have disturbed the Abbey's refined atmosphere. He carried a leather portfolio and notebook with the unobtrusive manner of one accustomed to recording conversations among those who preferred their words to remain private, his grey hair and steady demeanour suggesting reliability rather than threat. Lady Honoria received him with a courtesy due a professional gentleman, though her manner indicated clearly that his presence represented a regrettable necessity rather than a welcome addition to her household. "I must ask that our guests remain within the Abbey grounds until this matter is resolved," Alleyn explained, his tone carrying the authority of his position while maintaining the courtesy appropriate to the circumstances. "I trust this arrangement will not prove unduly inconvenient." The words were phrased as a request, yet their underlying meaning was unmistakable, and Lady Honoria's nod of acceptance acknowledged both the necessity and the temporary nature of what amounted to genteel detention. She withdrew to a place near the window that allowed her to listen without appearing to intrude, her silver hair catching the filtered light as she arranged her dark mourning dress with unconscious grace. Rosamund Vellacourt entered the drawing-room with the particular composure of one whose breeding had prepared her for difficult conversations, though Alleyn observed that her usual serenity seemed to require conscious effort. She wore a mourning dress of dark green wool, simply cut but perfectly fitted, her auburn hair arranged with the careful informality that suggested both haste and attention to appearance. When Alleyn inquired about her relationship with Sir Julian, her response carried undertones that seemed to extend beyond mere social acquaintance. "Sir Julian was persistent in his attentions," she said, her voice maintaining its cultured modulation despite what appeared to be considerable discomfort. "He had certain proposals regarding the Abbey's future that I found quite inappropriate." Her hands, clasped in her lap, showed the slight tension that suggested conversations she would prefer not to revisit. Fox, without looking up from his notebook, observed the faint discoloration just above the cuff of her sleeve, as if some grasp had been made and shaken off. "We spoke in the South Passage after dinner," she added, too promptly for comfort. Then, qualifying, "It was not a prolonged conversation. He could be most insistent when crossed." Dame Beatrice Latchford entered with the measured dignity of one making an entrance, though her theatrical instincts seemed subdued by the morning's events. She accepted Lady Honoria's offer of tea with gracious precision, her silver rings catching the firelight as she arranged her dark skirts. When the conversation turned to her professional relationship with Sir Julian, her response revealed depths of resentment carefully concealed beneath social courtesy. Sir Julian possessed the unfortunate tendency to confuse financial investment with artistic authority, she said, her voice carrying the particular edge of one whose professional reputation had been questioned by someone lacking the credentials to do so. "Last season he withdrew a commission on the advice of a younger lady whose name would not interest you. He suggested that my interpretation of Lady Macbeth showed signs of advancing age. Quite unnecessary, I thought, particularly from someone whose own theatrical experience extended no further than purchasing tickets." Her recounting was elegant, devoid of overt anger, yet the underlying resentment was clear, a carefully polished dagger of memory that had evidently retained its sharpness over time. Dr. Lionel Ferris appeared more composed than during the morning's discovery, though his scholarly demeanor seemed to carry an undercurrent of anxiety that extended beyond natural distress at violent death. His explanation of the Abbey's newly acquired psalter revealed both professional pride and what Alleyn recognized as defensive evasion. "The manuscript is quite extraordinary," he said, his fingers tracing nervous patterns on his trouser leg. "The provenance, while not completely documented, shows clear indications of 12th century origin." His enthusiasm for the medieval manuscript was evident in the precise inflection of his voice as he described its unique illuminations and the meticulous process of restoration. However, when Alleyn, with quiet courtesy, inquired about the specific dealer's receipt mentioned in the Abbey's records, Ferris became slightly more verbose, his explanations expanding to cover points that had not been directly questioned. "Bloomsbury," he said, and the word, though ordinary, came out as if it had to be fetched from a distance. "The original chain of custody is unimpeachable, Inspector. Sir Julian's suggestions regarding authentication were overly cautious, shall we say." The Reverend Peregrine Saumarez entered with the quiet dignity of his calling, though his usually serene features showed the strain of reconciling spiritual duties with temporal complications. His account of Sir Julian's relationship with the Abbey revealed the particular discomfort of one caught between pastoral obligations and social loyalties. "Sir Julian was most generous in his support of our restoration work," he said carefully, his hands clasped tightly before him, though his methods of ensuring cooperation sometimes conflicted with the spirit of Christian charity. He possessed certain information about parishioners that he felt gave him special insight into their spiritual needs. The delicate phrasing could not entirely conceal the implications of what amounted to systematic influence disguised as religious concern. When pressed gently about his movements during the evening, the Reverend acknowledged that he had been in the chapel until late, tending to the altar candles according to long custom. "Not the great church candles," he added with faint embarrassment, "which were not in use. I extinguished them myself when the house settled." The hem of his cassock showed a delicate fretting of wax, which he noticed at the same moment as Alleyn and brushed away with an apologetic gesture. Timothy Blaw's interview revealed the nervous honesty of one whose professional competence had been questioned by circumstances beyond his control. His account of the mechanical preparations for the mask showed both technical expertise and growing frustration with Sir Julian's demands for modifications. "The equipment was sound, Inspector," he insisted, his voice tight with professional anxiety. But Sir Julian's demands for an additional blackout after the main descent introduced variables that were not part of the original design. The auxiliary cables weren't designed for the additional weight he wanted to suspend. His hands shook slightly as he described discovering the altered knot. A seaman's bend, he called it, not his own work. "I left a brass pricket on the back of the font after checking the height with the candle. It was gone when I came at first light. I burnt my thumb on the wax. Matron Lusk can tell you the same. She gave me liniment for it." As each interview concluded, Alleyn found himself constructing a picture of Sir Julian Martin that extended far beyond the evening's theatrical patron. The man had moved through the Abbey's refined society like a predator disguised as a benefactor, using financial leverage and carefully gathered secrets to bend others to his will. Yet the very thoroughness of his manipulations had created multiple motives for his elimination, and each conversation revealed another layer of resentment carefully concealed beneath the veneer of social courtesy. Inspector Fox's quiet notation of responses and contradictions provided a counterpoint to Alleyn's more psychological observations, his methodical approach ensuring that no detail of timing or opportunity would be overlooked. The fire settled in the grate with a soft whisper, and beyond the diamond-paned windows, the Abbey's bell tower marked the passing hours with persistent regularity. As the afternoon light began to fade, Lady Honoria approached the writing desk where Alleyn sat in quiet contemplation. "Inspector," she said, her voice carrying a note of reluctance. This arrived with the morning post. She placed a long envelope upon the leather blotter, its cream paper bearing Sir Julian's distinctive handwriting in bold black ink. It is addressed to me, but given the circumstances. She did not complete the thought, but her meaning was clear. Alleyn observed that the envelope's corner bore a faint, dull smear, some metallic residue that caught the firelight without answering it, the same peculiar mark he had noticed on the font's rim. As he reached for the letter, the ancient house seemed to take a small, deliberate breath and hold it, while the correspondence from the dead lay between past and present like a secret waiting to be spoken. In the corridor outside, footsteps passed with deliberate softness, and Alleyn found himself wondering whether someone was listening to conversations that might determine the direction of his investigation, or attempting to ensure that certain truths remained safely buried beneath the Abbey's patient stones. Dawn arrived at Moonlight Abbey with the particular discretion of light that has learned patience from ancient stones, filtering through diamond-paned windows and settling into corners where shadows had gathered undisturbed since medieval times. The cloisters held that hushed quality peculiar to the hour before full morning, when night's secrets might yet be discovered before daylight erased their more telling traces. The mechanical moon, now motionless above the font, caught the early light like tarnished silver, reflecting events it could not speak, while dew had settled upon the flagstones with crystalline precision, each drop a small lens focusing the growing illumination. The air carried mingled scents of damp earth from the central garth and the lingering sweetness of beeswax, though the source of that fragrance remained elusive in the grey half-light that made mysteries of familiar shapes. Inspector Alleyn moved through this transformed landscape with the methodical attention of one trained to read stories written in displaced objects and altered arrangements, his grey eyes taking in details that the previous evening's shock had obscured. His examination of the ceremonial chords revealed a narrative of deliberate preparation masked as casual adjustment. The silk rope that had been wound about Sir Julian's throat showed signs of careful handling, not the desperate grip of sudden violence, but the measured preparation of someone who had planned each movement with theatrical precision. Near the chapel entrance, where the liturgical standards normally hung in ordered dignity, one cord had been recently rehung, its brass fittings showing the faint scratches that indicated recent removal and replacement. Most significantly, the auxiliary line that controlled the mechanical apparatus had been resecured with a seaman's bend, executed with nautical precision, yet showing the freshness of recent work against the weathered rope around it. The trail of candle wax that Alleyn had noted the previous evening proved more extensive in daylight examination, forming an irregular path from the chapel entrance to the font itself, then continuing along the south walk toward the domestic quarters. The drops were small but consistent, suggesting someone had carried a lit candle along this route during the hours of darkness, pausing frequently as if to examine their surroundings or ensure they remained unobserved. Near the base of the winch mechanism, a small pool of hardened wax showed the circular impression of something that had been removed before the substance had completely cooled, while behind the font, where the mechanical apparatus was anchored to the ancient stonework, that same dull silver residue he had observed on the font's rim was scattered as if someone had worked with painted or silvered materials in this shadowed space. Timothy Blore emerged from the north arcade with the hesitant step of one approaching a scene he would prefer to avoid, his morning clothes hastily arranged over what appeared to have been a sleepless night. His face bore the pallor of continued shock, yet when Alleyn questioned him about the mechanical preparations, his responses revealed a troubling pattern of outside interference that extended beyond Sir Julian's documented demands. "Someone asked me to test the auxiliary lines after the evening's rehearsal," he admitted, his voice tight with professional anxiety. The instruction came with such authority that I assumed it was at Sir Julian's direction, though thinking back, the voice was muffled by the arcade's acoustics. I cannot be certain who spoke. His hands trembled slightly as he demonstrated how he had lowered and raised the mechanical apparatus according to the mysterious instruction, checking tensions and adjustments that someone had deemed necessary for what they claimed would be a more dramatic effect. "I used beeswax on the friction points as requested," he continued, his voice growing more strained. "And I left a brass pricket from one of the church candles on the back of the font to mark the moon's lowest point. When I returned this morning, it had vanished entirely." Lady Honoria appeared in the cloister walk with the composed dignity of one who had learned to face unpleasant necessities without surrendering to emotion, though the morning light revealed lines of strain that the previous evening's candlelight had concealed. She wore a morning dress of dark blue wool, simply cut but perfectly fitted, her silver hair arranged with the careful attention that suggested both breeding and the recognition that appearances must be maintained even in crisis. When Alleyn inquired about the Abbey's financial circumstances with the particular tact required when investigating among one's social equals, her response revealed depths of concern that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. "Sir Julian's patronage was essential to our continued residence here," she said, her voice maintaining its cultured modulation despite obvious distress. "The restoration costs have exceeded our resources considerably, and certain debts require settlement within the year. Sir Julian was aware of our circumstances and had made his assistance conditional upon arrangements that I found increasingly difficult to accept." The conversation that followed revealed the extent of Sir Julian's financial leverage over the Abbey and its inhabitants, his offers of assistance coming with conditions that extended far beyond mere monetary exchange. He suggested that sentiment was an expensive luxury for those in reduced circumstances, Lady Honoria continued, her voice carrying undertones of carefully controlled anger. His proposals regarding the Psalter and other treasures were commercially astute, perhaps, but spiritually devastating. He possessed a talent for discovering what others preferred to keep private, and he considered such knowledge a legitimate tool for ensuring cooperation. I found his methods vulgar in the extreme, yet our circumstances left little room for the luxury of moral objections. Her hands, clasped before her with characteristic restraint, showed the slight tension that indicated conversations she would prefer not to revisit, while her admission carried the weight of someone acknowledging a burden that death had unexpectedly lifted. From the North Passage came the sound of quiet conversation conducted in the urgent undertones of those who believed themselves unobserved, and Alleyn observed matron Ada Lusk speaking with Rosamond Vellacourt near the entrance to the domestic quarters. The elderly woman's manner suggested the protective concern of one who had served the family through previous crises, her weathered hands reaching out in gestures of comfort, while Rosamond's responses, though inaudible at distance, were accompanied by the particular stillness that indicates emotional distress held firmly in check. The fragment of conversation that carried across the morning air. "After all these years, my dear, and he always knew, suggested secrets that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of Sir Julian's death, family matters that had somehow become entangled with the dead man's talent for discovering uncomfortable truths. When the two women became aware of observation, they separated with the practiced grace of those accustomed to maintaining propriety under scrutiny. Yet matron Lusk approached Alleyn with obvious reluctance, her grey dress and pristine apron suggesting competence rather than subservience. "Inspector," she said, her voice carrying the particular strain of one forced to report facts that might prove damaging to someone under her protection, "I discovered this while tidying Miss Rosamond's room this morning." She offered a small brass object that caught the morning light with familiar gleam, the missing pricket from the chapel candles that Blore had mentioned. "Miss Rosamond says she cannot account for its presence among her belongings, and I confess I find its appearance there most peculiar. It was placed quite deliberately upon her dressing table, not dropped or forgotten, but positioned as if someone wished it to be found." Rosamond herself emerged from the passage with the composed bearing that suggested considerable effort to maintain dignity under difficult circumstances. her morning dress showing careful attention despite the early hour. Yet Alleyn observed that her usually steady hands showed a slight tremor as she adjusted her shawl. When questioned about the brass pricket, her response carried undertones of confusion rather than guilt, though her composure seemed to require conscious maintenance. "I discovered it there upon waking," she said, her voice maintaining its cultured precision despite obvious distress. "I have no recollection of placing it among my belongings, nor can I imagine why anyone else would have done so. It seems a most extraordinary item to find in one's private chambers, particularly given the circumstances of last evening's tragedy." The morning light strengthened as these revelations accumulated, yet the abbey itself seemed to absorb the growing tension into its ancient stones, as if centuries of human drama had taught it patience with the recurring patterns of passion and deception. Each conversation revealed another layer of complexity beneath the previous evening's civilized surface. Financial desperation masked by social grace, family secrets protected by loyal service, and the systematic manipulation of private vulnerabilities by a man whose death had been accomplished with the same calculated precision he had brought to his exploitation of others. The mechanical moon continued its gentle sway above the font, no longer a theatrical prop, but a silent witness to events that had transformed cultural entertainment into something far more sinister. As the abbey's bell began its regular tolling, calling the hours with persistent authority, Alleyn found himself considering not merely the physical evidence of murder, but the intricate web of financial pressure, family secrets, and personal humiliation that had created multiple motives for Sir Julian's elimination. The brass pricket in his hand felt warm from human contact, yet its presence in Rosamond's room suggested either guilt carefully concealed or evidence deliberately planted by someone who understood the value of misdirection. Somewhere in the stone passages, a door closed with deliberate softness, and the faint echo seemed to carry the weight of secrets that remained carefully guarded despite the morning's revelations. The abbey's silence pressed upon every word like a living presence, patient and watchful, holding its own counsel while the investigation slowly uncovered truths that someone had killed to keep hidden. In that hushed interval between confession and accusation, the ancient stones seemed to take a small, deliberate breath and hold it, as if the very walls understood that the morning's discoveries had brought the investigation to a threshold from which there could be no retreat into comfortable ignorance. The library of Moonlight Abbey occupied the former scriptorium with the particular gravity of a space where knowledge had been both preserved and concealed across centuries. Its tall windows facing east to catch the morning light that medieval scribes had required for their illuminated manuscripts, though now electric lamps supplemented the natural illumination that fell across oak shelves lined with accumulated learning. The air carried the mingled scents of old leather bindings and aged paper, furniture, polish, and the lavender sachets that Lady Honoria employed to discourage moths among the more delicate volumes, while dust motes moved through shafts of autumnal sunlight like patient actors awaiting their cue. Persian carpets in faded jewel tones softened the flagstone floor, and comfortable reading chairs upholstered in worn velvet suggested scholarly contemplation rather than mere decoration. It was here that Inspector Alleyn had established his temporary headquarters. The abbey's accumulated records and correspondence spread across the refectory table with the methodical precision of one trained to find patterns in seemingly unrelated documents. Dr. Lionel Ferris entered the library with the particular hesitation of one approaching a space that had become unexpectedly threatening to his professional reputation, his scholarly composure showing signs of strain that extended beyond natural distress at violent death. His examination of the documents that Alleyn had arranged for review revealed the nervous precision of someone whose expertise was being challenged by evidence he could not entirely explain away. The discovery of inconsistencies in the Salter's provenance, discrepancies in dates, variations in supposedly identical dealers' marks, and paper that seemed suspiciously fresh for a medieval manuscript prompted increasingly defensive responses that suggested vulnerabilities extending far beyond scholarly pride. Alleyn's attention had been drawn to Dr. Ferris's private study, a narrow room tucked within the thickness of an outer wall where the smell of vellum, size, and old paste created its own cloistered climate. His methodical examination of the room's 18th-century paneling revealed subtle variations in wood grain that suggested concealed storage, and his trained fingers found the nearly inaudible click of wood against wood when he pressed the back of an unremarkable calf volume. The panel quivered and slid with the languor of old carpentry, revealing a cavity no larger than a ledger containing materials that spoke eloquently of systematic deception. An inkwell of gum, a small gessoed tablet, a stoppered phial containing fine silver powder, and a sheaf of foolscap carefully weighted with a seal stone. The topmost sheet proved to be a colophon worked with loving artifice in what appeared to be a 12th-century hand. Yet the strokes, though correct, lay upon rag paper bearing a modern watermark, faint as a conscience. Beneath it, a dealer's receipt from Bloomsbury showed dates inconsistent by a season and figures altered by a cautious pen, while practice sheets revealed attempts to reproduce the particular style of illumination that had made the Psalter so remarkable. Dr. Ferris's pallor deepened into scholarly grey as these discoveries accumulated before him. "I amended nothing for personal gain," he said at last, his voice seeking dignity within confession. "Authentication has its theatre, Inspector. One gives a nervous patron confidence. The Psalter is genuine. I merely embellished the narrative line to persuade those who required persuasion." His fingers hovered above the phial of silver powder. Sir Julian knew. He called it fraud and undertook to control the revelation of that knowledge in exchange for arrangements I found increasingly difficult to accept. Dame Beatrice Latchford received Alleyn later in the morning room, where she was engaged in the delicate task of arranging chrysanthemums in a Georgian silver vase, her movements precise and almost ritualistic, as if each bloom represented a carefully chosen emotion. She wore a dark gown that absorbed the light and returned it as a subtle sheen, her hands maintaining an actor's studied quiet as she spoke of her relationship with Sir Julian. "We had a history that extended far beyond mere professional acquaintance," she said, her voice carrying its characteristic resonance despite obvious strain. "Some years ago he withdrew a commission at a most delicate hour, claiming that my interpretation of Lady Macbeth showed signs of what he termed advancing years and diminished passion. The production collapsed entirely, taking with it my reputation and the savings I had invested in preparation. But that was merely the beginning of his campaign to ensure my cooperation in matters where he required artistic credibility to mask commercial vulgarity." Her account revealed Sir Julian's systematic approach to influence, his talent for discovering professional vulnerabilities and exploiting them with ruthless efficiency. "He possessed certain letters," Dame Beatrice continued, her voice maintaining its theatrical precision, "correspondence from a period when I was young and perhaps less discriminating in my choice of confidants. Nothing scandalous by modern standards, yet sufficient to damage one's reputation if presented with the particular malice he brought to such revelations. He considered such knowledge a legitimate tool for ensuring cooperation, and he wielded it with the precision of a surgeon's blade. The pattern of manipulation that emerged from these conversations revealed Sir Julian Martin as a man who had moved through refined society like a predator disguised as a patron, using financial leverage and carefully gathered secrets to bend others to his will. Each relationship had been systematically cultivated to provide maximum advantage, creating a web of obligation and fear that extended throughout the Abbey's community. Alleyn found himself constructing a portrait of systematic exploitation that went far beyond mere business ruthlessness, extending into the realm of psychological cruelty practiced with the precision of an art form. That night, as the Abbey settled into its accustomed silence, The particular stillness was shattered by a sharp cry from the winding night stair that connected the upper chambers to the cloisters below. Timothy Blore, unable to sleep for anxiety about his mechanical apparatus and the investigation that seemed to focus increasingly upon his technical expertise, had ventured down the worn stone steps to check once more upon the scene of Sir Julian's death. The loosened stone that nearly sent him tumbling into the cloister below had been carefully prepared, its mortar chipped away with the precision of someone who understood both the stair's construction and the likely consequences of a fall from that height onto the flagstones below. Only his instinctive grab for the rope banister, installed centuries earlier for precisely such emergencies, saved him from what would have appeared to be a tragic accident during a night of understandable restlessness. Alleyn, who had acquired ears for such notes of distress, was there with Fox and Matron Lusk almost before Blore had found breath to explain his narrow escape. The evidence of deliberate sabotage was unmistakable. A thin black cord, theater stuff waxed and nearly invisible, had been stretched across the stair at ankle height, one end tied to an iron ring in the wall with the same practical love of secure knots that had characterized the auxiliary lines upon the mechanical apparatus. The incident confirmed that someone among the Abbey's confined company possessed both the knowledge and the determination to silence potential witnesses to Sir Julian's murder, using methods that suggested intimate familiarity with both the building's architecture and the habits of its inhabitants. The following morning brought a clear sky and diminished temperature as the Abbey's chapel received its small company for early service, the air carrying the faint scent of cold stone and beeswax mingled with a thread of incense that had clung there since another century. The Reverend Peregrine Salmares ascended to the pulpit with movements that appeared correct yet somehow strained, his voice, when he began carrying its usual impeccable authority, despite undertones that suggested personal struggle extending beyond pastoral duty. He preached upon light in darkness, upon the revealing of hidden things, upon the duty to speak truth even when truth offended those who loved delicacy. The phrases rode the ribs of the nave in fine, unanswerable lines, yet Alleyn, who possessed a taste for scholarly phrasing, recognized in one eloquent turn a cadence he had read that morning in a forged colophon, a medieval tag, shifted and modernized, dragged into service once more. As the final response fell away into the chapel's ancient silence, Alleyn noticed a new drip of wax, clear and domed on the topmost choir step where no candle had stood during the service, and observed how the Reverend's hand went, quick as a private thought, to his throat and stayed there a moment longer than liturgy required. The sermon had been a masterpiece of pastoral comfort, yet in the Reverend's earnest gaze, in the slight tightening of his jaw when he spoke of earthly transgressions, Alleyn detected a note that resonated with something beyond mere theological conviction, a burden carried and perhaps, in the quiet solitude of clerical conscience, a guilt wrestled with and not entirely subdued. The organ muttered and stopped, while a swallow, winter astray, made a single pointless flight under the roof and was still. The Abbey seemed to listen as the words about light and hidden things did not so much conclude as hover in the incense-laden air and in the faint scent of wax and silver polish that had become associated with the investigation. Alleyn felt rather than knew that something not yet seen had taken its appointed place among the properties of this carefully staged drama. As the congregation dispersed into the grey morning light, the mechanical moon remained visible through the chapel's ancient windows, swaying gently above the font where Sir Julian had met his calculated end, its silver surface reflecting secrets it could not reveal while the Abbey's stones maintained their patient silence, holding truths that someone would kill again to keep hidden. The shadows were indeed lengthening, both literally and figuratively, as the investigation moved inexorably toward revelations that someone among them was prepared to prevent at any cost. The Abbey's library occupied the former scriptorium with the particular gravity of a space where knowledge had been both preserved and concealed across centuries, its tall windows facing east to catch the morning light that medieval scribes had required for their illuminated manuscripts, though now the autumn afternoon cast longer shadows across oak shelves lined with accumulated learning. The wide stone hearth bore the patina of countless fires, its carved mantelpiece blackened by generations of scholarly pursuits, while the air carried mingled scents of old leather bindings, aged paper, and the more acrid undertones of documents that had been fed to flames for purposes extending far beyond mere warmth. Persian carpets in faded jewel tones softened the flagstone floor, and dust motes moved through shafts of light with the particular restlessness of secrets disturbed from their intended rest. Inspector Fox knelt beside the cold hearth with the methodical precision of one trained to find meaning in what others had attempted to destroy, his solid presence lending professional competence to the delicate archaeological task before him. Using a paper knife with the careful movements of a conservator, he coaxed from beneath the fire bars fragments that flaked into thin plates, not the expected clinker of ordinary combustion, but portions of paper, charred at the edges and fused in places like leaves of a blackened book. The quality of the salvaged material spoke eloquently of documents someone had considered too dangerous to preserve. Heavy writing paper bearing watermarks from respectable stationers, carbon paper that suggested systematic copying, and the distinctive blue-black ink favored by those who still employed fountain pens for correspondence requiring both elegance and permanence. Alleyn arranged the brittle fragments upon the library table with practiced hands, reconstructing narratives from what fire and prudence had left behind. The first surprise was the scope of the documentation, letterheads from the Abbey, Dame Beatrice's theatrical agency, and what appeared to be correspondence with the Bloomsbury antiquarian dealer, whose authenticity had already come into question. The second revelation was the systematic nature of what these papers revealed. Not random correspondence, but a carefully maintained ledger of human vulnerabilities, each weakness catalogued and cross-referenced for maximum leverage. Phrases survived the flames like accusations. Arrangement unsatisfactory. Authentication procedures require discretion. Reputation once lost cannot be recovered. And most ominously, failure to comply will necessitate immediate exposure. Dr. Lionel Ferris entered the library with the particular hesitation of one approaching professional devastation, his scholarly composure maintained through visible effort as he observed the careful reconstruction of documents he had presumably believed safely destroyed. His pale fingers trembled slightly as Fox indicated fragments bearing violet annotations in a hand remarkably similar to his own. Among the charred remains lay what appeared to be draft versions of the fabricated colophon discovered in his study, complete with marginalia, suggesting alternative phrasing and careful notes about ink consistency. "Sir Julian required a narrative line, Inspector," Ferris said at last, his voice seeking dignity within confession. "He found the truth insufficiently theatrical for his purposes. I corrected nothing of the manuscript itself, only its provenance. There is a difference." His words carried the weight of a man whose professional identity had been held hostage to commercial necessity, scholarly pride transformed into systematic deception under relentless pressure. Dame Beatrice Latchford appeared in the doorway with the measured dignity of one making a difficult entrance, her theatrical bearing subdued by the morning's discoveries yet maintaining the composed grace that had sustained her through decades of performance. She wore burgundy wool that emphasized her pallor, her silver hair arranged with careful attention despite the circumstances. When Alleyn indicated fragments referencing her correspondence, her response revealed vulnerabilities carefully concealed beneath social grace. Sir Julian's zeal in collecting trifles from one's past was indefatigable, she said, her voice maintaining theatrical precision despite obvious strain. Early letters, foolish outpourings written when one's capacity for judgment was wretchedly untrained. He suggested quite coolly that the public might be enlightened as to my passionate history should I fail to accommodate his schemes. The burned fragments spoke of youthful indiscretions and correspondence that might prove embarrassing if presented with suitable dramatic flourish, revealing Sir Julian's talent for transforming private sentiment into public scandal through careful presentation and timing. Rosamond Velicott entered with composed bearing that suggested considerable effort to maintain dignity under increasingly impossible circumstances, her mourning dress showing careful attention despite the strain of recent days. Her examination of the recovered documents revealed the particular distress of one whose family's honor had been catalogued for future exploitation. The manuscript fragments contained references to the Abbey's precarious financial position, specific figures and balances, and most damaging, allusions to previous irregularities concerning the endowment that could be exposed if cooperation was not forthcoming. Sir Julian was most thorough in his research, she said quietly, her voice carrying undertones of carefully controlled anger. He possessed information regarding family arrangements that I had believed safely buried in the past. His proposals for the Abbey's future were conditional upon my cooperation in matters that I found increasingly difficult to accept. The pattern that emerged from these revelations painted Sir Julian Martin as a predator who had moved through refined society with calculated precision, using his position as cultural patron to gain access to private information that he then employed for systematic manipulation. His correspondence revealed not merely business ruthlessness, but sophisticated psychological warfare, each letter carefully crafted to maintain civilized discourse while delivering unmistakable threats. The burned fragments suggested someone had attempted to destroy evidence of this exploitation, yet the incomplete nature of their destruction indicated either haste or interruption in the process. Alleyn's reconstruction of events began to assume new dimensions as he considered the convergence of motives the recovered documents revealed. Dr. Ferris faced professional ruin if his scholarly forgeries were exposed, his reputation dependent upon maintaining the Psalter's fictional authenticity. Dame Beatrice confronted the destruction of a theatrical career already damaged by Sir Julian's previous interventions, her survival dependent upon preventing further revelations about her personal history. Rosamond's situation appeared most complex, involving family secrets that extended beyond financial embarrassment to matters that might prove socially devastating if revealed to modern scrutiny. Inspector Fox's methodical examination revealed additional evidence of systematic destruction attempted during the hours following Sir Julian's death. The position of charred fragments suggested burning had been interrupted, perhaps by other household members, or recognition that complete destruction required more time than was safely available. Most significantly, the presence of carbon paper among burned materials indicated someone had been creating copies of sensitive documents, suggesting either preparation for expanded blackmail or preservation of evidence for future use. As afternoon light strengthened, the library seemed to absorb growing tension into its ancient atmosphere, centuries of accumulated knowledge preparing it for revelations that challenged comfortable assumptions of civilized society. Each recovered fragment added another layer to the complex web Sir Julian had constructed around the Abbey's inhabitants, his systematic exploitation creating multiple motives for elimination, while providing each suspect with desperate reasons to prevent further investigation. Fox approached with a final fragment that had been wedged beneath the grate, its preservation more complete due to its protected position. The text, in Sir Julian's characteristic hand, proved to be a draft letter beginning with ominous formality. My dear friend, I believe the time has come for a complete understanding between us regarding certain arrangements that can no longer be postponed. The letter remained unfinished, its intended recipient unspecified, yet implications were clear. Sir Julian had been preparing to escalate his campaign of manipulation at the very moment someone decided such escalation could not be permitted. The library fell into contemplative silence as full implications became apparent, the ancient room holding its breath while Alleyn considered the convergence of desperation and opportunity that had transformed cultural patronage into systematic exploitation and ultimately calculated murder. The charred fragments lay upon the table like pieces of a puzzle, slowly revealing Sir Julian's cruelty and his victim's desperation. Yet the identity of his killer remained hidden among the very people whose circumstances had provided both motive and justification for his elimination. In that hushed interval between discovery and accusation, the Abbey's accumulated wisdom seemed to press upon every revelation, patient and watchful, while somewhere in the stone passages beyond, a door closed with deliberate softness, carrying the weight of secrets that remained carefully guarded despite the morning's devastating disclosures. The morning room of Moonlight Abbey possessed the particular intimacy of a space designed for confidential conversation, its mullioned windows overlooking the herb garden where autumn light filtered through diamond panes to cast gentle patterns across furniture chosen for comfort rather than ceremony. Persian carpets in muted tones softened the flagstone floor, while a small fire burned steadily in the carved stone hearth, its warmth necessary against the October chill that seemed to penetrate even the Abbey's most carefully appointed chambers. The air carried mingled scents of dried lavender from sachets among the cushions, beeswax polish, and the faint aroma of china. Tea from a Georgian service that suggested civilized discourse, despite the circumstances that had made such discourse necessary. It was here that Inspector Alleyn had chosen to conduct his most delicate inquiries, recognizing that certain admissions required privacy and the particular tact appropriate when investigating among one's social equals. Dame Beatrice Latchford entered with the measured dignity of one approaching a performance that might determine her professional survival, her theatrical bearing maintained through visible effort as she arranged her dark skirts with unconscious grace. When Alleyn inquired about her final conversation with Sir Julian, her response revealed depths of anger carefully concealed beneath social courtesy. "I informed Sir Julian that his threats had exceeded the bounds of civilized discourse," she said, her voice carrying its characteristic resonance despite obvious strain. "I suggested that a man who employed blackmail as readily as others used calling cards might discover that the theatre possessed its own methods of ensuring justice. He found my dramatic metaphors amusing, claiming that actresses were notorious for gestures without substance." Her hands, clasped in her lap with characteristic restraint, showed the slight discoloration that Alleyn had observed before, traces of silver powder that might have come from theatrical makeup or from contact with the mechanical apparatus that had provided such convenient concealment for murder. Dr. Lionel Ferris appeared with the particular hesitation of one whose scholarly reputation had been systematically dismantled by recent revelations, his pale features showing the strain of maintaining professional composure while acknowledging systematic deception. The Psalter required authentication that would satisfy modern scrutiny, he said, his voice seeking dignity within confession. Sir Julian's demands went beyond scholarly enhancement to deliberate fabrication. I found myself creating an entire provenance, complete with supporting documentation, to justify his investment. His fingers trembled slightly as he described the gradual escalation of Sir Julian's demands. He possessed copies of my preliminary work, draft colophons, practice illuminations, correspondence with dealers who had never existed. He threatened to present these as evidence of systematic fraud unless I continued to provide scholarly credibility for his increasingly dubious acquisitions. Rosamond Velicott entered with composed bearing that suggested considerable effort to maintain dignity under circumstances that had become impossible to sustain through breeding alone. Her account of Sir Julian's proposals regarding the Abbey's future revealed the particular distress of one whose family honor had been held hostage to financial necessity. Sir Julian's assistance came with conditions that extended far beyond monetary exchange, she said, her voice maintaining cultured modulation despite obvious discomfort. He required control over the Abbey's treasures, including arrangements for their eventual disposition that I found spiritually devastating. But more than that, he possessed information regarding family matters that I believed safely buried in the past, correspondence that would destroy my aunt's reputation and our standing in society should it become public knowledge. Inspector Fox entered with methodical precision, carrying a leather portfolio that suggested significant discoveries. "The timing troubles me, sir," he said quietly to Alleyn. "The blackout lasted precisely long enough for someone to position the body and arrange the mechanical apparatus, yet too brief for extensive preparation. Either the killer possessed extraordinary luck, or the murder was accomplished through methods requiring intimate knowledge of both the Abbey's routines and the mask's technical requirements." Matron Ada Lusk approached with obvious reluctance, carrying a small packet wrapped in brown paper. "I discovered these among Sir Julian's belongings while attending to the necessary arrangements," she said, her voice carrying the particular strain of one reporting facts she would prefer to conceal. The packet contained correspondence that revealed the systematic nature of Sir Julian's intelligence gathering. Letters from servants in other households, reports from tradesmen, and, most damaging, copies of personal correspondence obtained through methods that spoke of systematic violation of privacy. "There should be 12 letters, Inspector," she said with the precision of one accustomed to maintaining household accounts. "I count only 11. One has been removed, and recently, judging by the disturbance to the packet's arrangement." As these revelations accumulated, Alleyn found himself confronting not merely individual motives, but a convergence of desperation that suggested possibilities extending beyond simple theories of guilt. Each suspect possessed compelling reasons for eliminating Sir Julian, yet the ritualistic staging of the murder, the ceremonial cord, the precise timing, the theatrical use of the mechanical apparatus, suggested someone with both intimate knowledge of the Abbey's sacred traditions and a mind that appreciated dramatic effect. The systematic nature of Sir Julian's exploitation had created an atmosphere where multiple individuals possessed both motive and opportunity, yet the particular method of his elimination spoke of careful planning that transcended spontaneous violence. The fire settled in the grate with a soft whisper, and as afternoon light began to fade, Alleyn observed Fox examining something near the window seat with particular attention. "Sir," Fox said quietly, "there's something here that might interest you." Wedged behind the cushions was a fragment of heavy writing paper, torn raggedly as if someone had attempted to destroy it hastily. The visible portion bore Sir Julian's characteristics. Handwriting: "My dear P, I believe the time has come for a complete understanding regarding certain arrangements that can no longer be postponed. Your position requires—" The remainder had been torn away, yet the implication was clear. Someone whose name began with P had been the intended recipient of what appeared to be Sir Julian's final ultimatum. The ancient house seemed to take a small, deliberate breath and hold it as the significance of this discovery settled upon the investigation. Somewhere in the stone passages beyond, a door closed with deliberate softness, and the mechanical moon, visible through the morning room's windows, swayed gently in the gathering dusk as if disturbed by secrets that remained carefully guarded despite the day's revelations. The interplay of motives had been laid bare, yet the identity of Sir Julian's killer remained hidden among the very people whose circumstances had provided both justification and opportunity for his elimination, while the torn letter fragment suggested that the final confrontation was yet to come. The cloisters of Moonlight Abbey received evening like an old confidant, accepting the fading light into their arches with a serenity that made the staging of human affairs appear at once grand and trivial. Electric lanterns, positioned with theatrical precision, cast pools of silver light across flagstones that had witnessed centuries of human drama, while the mechanical moon hung suspended above the ancient font like a tarnished mirror reflecting secrets it could not speak. The air carried mingled scents of damp earth from the central garth and late chrysanthemums, while a faint chill from the stone seemed to gather the evening's tensions into its patient embrace. The assembled company moved to their appointed positions with the careful precision of actors who understood that this final performance would determine far more than mere artistic success. Inspector Alleyn stood where the nave would once have opened, regarding his small audience with the particular authority of one who had mastered both the physical evidence and the psychological complexities that had made murder seem inevitable to someone among them. His grey eyes took in each face with quiet attention, noting the subtle variations in composure that distinguished genuine shock from carefully maintained performance, while Inspector Fox positioned himself with unobtrusive efficiency to observe reactions that might prove more revealing than prepared statements. "If you will permit me, Lady Honoria," Alleyn said, his voice carrying that gentle, unassailable authority which suggests command without display, "we shall ask everyone to resume their position as on the night of the rehearsal. The reconstruction will proceed according to the original sequence, with one significant addition: the auxiliary cord that provided such convenient concealment for murder." Lady Honoria inclined her head with composed dignity, taking her position near the south walk with the bearing of one whose breeding required that even investigation be conducted with proper ceremony. Dame Beatrice Latchford moved to the lectern with theatrical instincts that identified the acoustically superior location despite the evening's grimmer purpose, her black velvet merging with shadows, while her pale hands showed the faint residue of silver powder that caught the artificial moonlight. Dr. Lionel Ferris positioned himself near the mechanical apparatus with scholarly precision, his nervous attention focused upon equipment whose technical requirements he understood with uncomfortable thoroughness. Captain Hugh Davenant emerged from the North Arcade with military bearing, while Timothy Blore occupied his station among the control mechanisms with professional anxiety evident in every gesture. The Reverend Peregrine Saumarez approached his position near the chapel entrance with clerical dignity that seemed to require conscious maintenance, his usually composed features showing strain that extended beyond natural distress at violent death. When Alleyn indicated the precise placement required for the reconstruction, the Reverend's movement revealed a slight hesitation, as if approaching familiar ground that had become unexpectedly threatening to his spiritual composure. Rosamond Vellacourt stood with Lady Honoria, her mourning dress showing careful attention despite the circumstances, while Matron Ada Lusk remained in the background with the watchful presence of one who had served the family through previous crises. The sequence began with normal preparation for the mask's climactic effect, Alleyn continued, his tone as mild as if he explained a garden contrivance. Mr. Blore tested the mechanical descent according to his customary routine, yet someone had prepared modifications that extended far beyond Sir Julian's documented demands. He drew down the auxiliary line with quiet hands, showing how a loop had been prepared in the ceremonial cord and positioned beneath the moon's lowest point. A seaman's bend at this end, very neatly done, that would bear a smooth and noiseless draw. In the blackout, the loop could be set over a head easily if one was already at the font, involved in some small adjustment, and the auxiliary line pulled steadily by a person standing behind the shadow of the apparatus. As the lights died with theatrical suddenness, plunging the cloisters into profound darkness, Alleyn's voice continued with quiet authority. During this interval, someone moved with practiced precision across flagstones they knew intimately, approaching Sir Julian with the ceremonial cord already prepared for its deadly purpose. The mechanical moon continued its descent according to plan, providing both concealment and distraction while murder was accomplished with theatrical efficiency. The demonstration revealed how someone could have approached the font unobserved, accomplished their purpose, and returned to their appointed place before illumination revealed the completed tragedy. When light returned, the scene appeared unchanged, yet Allen's careful positioning had revealed the method with unmistakable clarity. The auxiliary line was prepared earlier, requiring access and immunity from comment, he observed, stepping to the base of the traverse where a pale bead of wax was preserved in a crevice. A man in a cassock, or anyone known to attend upon the chapel, might pass unquestioned with a church candle. The wax runs from the chapel door to the font, from the font to the south walk, and thence to the domestic passage. The pricket, removed from the back of the font, was later found among Miss Vellicott's belongings, a vulgar trick that does not help us admire the intelligence of its contriver. Alleyn's handkerchief, immaculate and dampened at one corner, brushed the rim of the font and turned to present a faint, dull bloom upon the linen. "There is a paint upon several things that should not carry it," he said, approaching the place where the Reverend stood. "This silver residue appears upon the font's rim where the loop was adjusted, and—" he touched the cuff of the cassock with the same handkerchief, "upon fabric that has been in recent contact with the mechanical apparatus. The new smear appeared against the white linen, twin to the first, a whisper of paint that had taken to cloth with damning precision." Inspector Fox produced a paper fragment with methodical care. "The Latin tag from the masque's finale, sir. Found among the burned correspondence." Alleyn read without emphasis a phrase that had appeared in the forged colophon, complete with its errant accent and modern turn of a medieval word. "We encountered this again yesterday morning, in an excellent sermon. An unusual choice for a parochial homily, more unusual in that the small scholarly inaccuracy is repeated precisely. A trained scholar does not err so consistently, but a man who had copied the phrase from papers, not his own, would carry both the slip and the accent with it." The silence that followed moved like a slow tide through the cloisters, carrying with it the weight of inevitable revelation. The Reverend Peregrine Saumarez stood motionless, his clerical bearing maintained through visible effort as the implications became unmistakable. His pale features showed the strain of maintaining composure while acknowledging truth that challenged comfortable assumptions about spiritual authority and moral duty. "Sir Julian possessed certain information regarding parish finances," he said at last, his voice seeking dignity within confession. "Arrangements that had been necessary during difficult years, yet which could be presented as deliberate deception if revealed to ecclesiastical authority. He required my cooperation in matters that conflicted with both spiritual duty and personal conscience, threatening exposure if I failed to accommodate his increasingly impossible demands." The mechanical moon continued its gentle sway above the font, no longer a theatrical prop, but a silent witness to the convergence of desperation and opportunity that had transformed cultural patronage into calculated murder. As the ancient bell began its regular tolling, the cloisters seemed to absorb the evening's revelations into their patient stones, adding another chapter to the endless drama of human ambition and frailty that had played out within these walls across centuries of accumulated wisdom. Alleyn folded the marked handkerchief with characteristic precision, his grey eyes holding the particular compassion reserved for those whose circumstances had driven them beyond the boundaries of civilized conduct. "Mr. Fox," he said softly, "we shall require the letter fragment and the sermon notes for our record. Mr. Blore, secure the apparatus." He turned to the assembled company with grave consideration that made his words both request and courtesy. "I believe we should now speak privately." The abbey made no sound but a stir of air among the arches, and from the bell tower, a single low note that shivered and was gone, while the mechanical moon swung once in the gathering darkness and came to rest, reflecting no face at all in its tarnished silver surface that had witnessed the final act of a drama played out with the particular cruelty that only civilized society could devise. The vestry of Moonlight Abbey possessed the particular stillness of a space arranged for quiet decisions, its oak presses standing round the walls like discreet retainers, while a narrow window admitted the pale morning light that spared the room's ancient furnishings any temptation to shine. The bell rope, newly tied off and secured, hung near the door with its loose strand caught and stilled, and in the air there lingered the cold, clean scent of stone untroubled by incense, mingled with the faint aroma of old linen and brass polish that spoke of centuries of clerical devotion. A small table bore an orderly array of objects, a brass candlestick with its wick unlit, a leather-bound Bible whose edges had been touched smooth by long use, and a simple wooden cross that caught the filtered light with humble dignity. Inspector Alleyn, who had always held private respect for rooms that kept their counsel, stood beside this table and regarded not the objects upon it, but the man seated beyond them in quiet contemplation. The Reverend Peregrine Saumarez had removed his surplice and sat in his dark clerical coat, his hands composed upon his knees with the particular stillness of one who had wrestled with conscience and emerged, if not victorious, at least reconciled to the necessity of truth. His pale features bore the exhaustion of a soul that had confronted its own darkness, yet there remained about him the dignity that his calling had instilled through years of pastoral service. When Alleyn approached with the quiet courtesy appropriate to both the setting and the man's spiritual office, the conversation that followed revealed depths of moral complexity that extended far beyond simple theories of guilt and innocence. "It need not be theatrical, Mr. Saumarez," Alleyn said gently, his voice carrying the timbre of understanding rather than accusation. "We are past the demonstration. What remains is acknowledgement, brief, sufficient, and in its way, merciful." His grey eyes held the particular compassion reserved for those whose circumstances had driven them beyond the boundaries of civilized conduct, yet whose motives remained comprehensible to anyone who understood the weight of spiritual responsibility. The Reverend's hands shifted once and were still again. "Sir Julian's methods were systematic, Inspector," he said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of one accustomed to speaking difficult truths. He discovered irregularities in parish accounts, arrangements made during the war years when survival required compromises that peacetime scrutiny might find difficult to understand. But beyond mere financial embarrassment, he threatened to expose these as deliberate fraud, to destroy not merely my reputation, but the spiritual welfare of those who depended upon this ministry. His voice carried the weight of a man whose life's work had been held hostage to commercial necessity. He delighted in the prospect of public humiliation, suggesting that my faith itself was merely another performance for his amusement. "The pressure must have been considerable," Alleyn observed, his tone suggesting understanding rather than judgment. "Sir Julian possessed a particular genius for identifying vulnerabilities and exploiting them with ruthless efficiency. The act was prepared with care, the auxiliary chord, the precise timing, the ceremonial staging. Pride, Mr. Saumarez, is not an ecclesiastical monopoly, nor is the fear of disgrace peculiar to any single calling." The Reverend met Alleyn's gaze directly. He mocked the sacred ritual, Inspector, suggested I perform what he termed theatrical Christianity for his entertainment, so long as it drew crowds and justified his investment. The darkness, the moon's descent, the ancient font, it seemed a fitting stage for his final performance. Some things are more sacred than reputation, more precious than personal preservation. The Abbey itself, its spirit, its truth, they deserved protection from his vulgarity. Inspector Fox entered with methodical discretion, carrying the documentation required for official proceedings while maintaining the quiet efficiency that allowed legal necessities to be addressed without unnecessary drama. The arrangements he described would ensure justice while preserving appropriate dignity, recognizing that some truths served society better when handled with restraint rather than sensational exposure. Later, in Lady Honoria's drawing room, the fire had been mended, and the morning light fell gently through diamond-paned windows onto furniture that seemed to breathe more easily in the aftermath of truth acknowledged. Dr. Lionel Ferris sat with scholarly composure restored, his relief evident as Alleyn addressed the question of the Psalter's authenticity. "The manuscript is substantially what it appears to be, Dr. Ferris," Alleyn said with quiet authority. "Your authentication was correct, only the supporting documentation was enhanced to satisfy Sir Julian's theatrical requirements. The Abbey possesses a genuine treasure that requires no artificial embellishment to justify its cultural significance. Dame Beatrice Latchford stood beside the mantel with theatrical dignity renewed, her silver hair catching the morning light as she discussed plans for continuing the Abbey's cultural mission without the corrupting influence of Sir Julian's patronage. "The masque will continue," she said, her voice carrying its characteristic resonance, "when appropriate. The Abbey deserves celebration of its genuine treasures rather than exploitation of manufactured mysteries." Her letters, as Alleyn assured her, would see no public light. They were not his to keep, and would burn under her own supervision, a gesture that restored both privacy and professional dignity. Rosamond Vellacott appeared composed, yet visibly relieved, the burden of family secrets no longer quite so crushing, now that Sir Julian's systematic blackmail had been exposed and ended. Lady Honoria, though outwardly maintaining her aristocratic composure, moved through the resolution with quiet dignity that bespoke profound weariness, tempered by grateful recognition that the Abbey's worth extended far beyond temporary scandal. "Its stones have witnessed centuries, Lady Honoria," Alleyn observed gently. "They will bear witness to many more. Truth, however painful, often serves to cleanse and allow for new beginnings." As the remaining guests prepared for departure, the Abbey seemed to settle back into its accustomed rhythms with the particular peace that follows honest confession and appropriate justice. Captain Davenant offered a respectful nod, his military bearing suggesting approval of resolution achieved without unnecessary public spectacle. Timothy Blore moved with renewed confidence, freed from the insidious demands that had compromised his professional integrity. Matron Ada Lusk resumed her household duties with the satisfied efficiency of one whose loyalty to the family had been vindicated by events. The great bell of Moonlight Abbey, which had remained silent throughout the morning's proceedings, resumed its measured tolling as the last motor car departed down the gravelled drive. Its voice carried across the countryside with renewed authority, marking the hours with the persistent dignity that had characterized the Abbey's endurance through centuries of human drama. Alleyn walked once more through the cloisters, now empty save for the patient stones and the gentle autumn light that fell, through ancient arches onto flagstones worn smooth by countless generations of contemplative footsteps. The mechanical moon lay dismantled in Blore's careful custody, its silver surface reflecting only innocent sunlight rather than the sinister purposes it had served during that fatal masque. The ceremonial cords had been returned to their appointed places, their silk restored to liturgical dignity after serving purposes far removed from ecclesiastical ceremony. Near the font, where the morning light fell most directly, no trace remained of the silver residue that had provided such telling evidence. The ancient stone had been cleaned and blessed, ready to resume its sacred function of spiritual renewal, rather than serving as stage for human tragedy. As Alleyn approached his waiting motor car, he paused beneath the Abbey's ancient gatehouse to take a final survey of cloisters that had taught him something profound about the delicate balance between truth and compassion that marked the finest achievements of civilized society. The investigation had revealed not merely the mechanics of murder, but the complex interplay of ambition, fear, and desperate love of honor that could drive even the most unlikely individuals to violence when pushed beyond endurance by systematic cruelty. The Abbey itself, ancient and enduring, seemed to breathe more easily as the mystery reached its conclusion, its long history having absorbed another chapter of human frailty into the timeless narrative written in its stones. The bell tower marked the passing hour with measured authority, its voice carrying like a benediction over secrets that could finally rest in peace, while the patient walls resumed their eternal watch over human affairs with the serene confidence of stones that had witnessed both the worst and best of mortal nature, and found reasons for hope in both. As Alleyn's motor car passed beneath the gatehouse and into the wider world beyond, the Abbey settled into its accustomed quiet, holding its truths with the discretion that centuries had taught, while the autumn light fell gently through ancient glass onto chambers where justice and mercy had found their proper balance at last.